maybe you'd feel like your mind is setting some goals over here and then your body is doing the complete opposite over here. You just feel like, you can't be consistent or you can't stick at anything. So what if it isn't about more discipline and disciplining yourself, but actually how you learn to be in relationship with yourself? Welcome to the We Are Enough podcast. I'm your host, Vive. You don't need more discipline, you need capacity. In fact, what I found is that trying to be more disciplined is actually, or could be, the thing that is triggering your own protective patterns. And the thing about discipline is it has this punitive tone to it, whereas capacity is asking, like, what does this organism that is me need in order to thrive? 20 years ago, I developed an eating disorder, and the way that I understand it now is that this pattern helped me to manage what was overwhelming for my system. It was a way of protecting me. Basically, the food desensitized me and put me into a coma. And so I would go through this binge, purge, reset pattern where I would be like, okay, now I'm empty and I'm ready to start again. You can feel the thread of perfectionism in there. And that's the trap, is that we reach for the thing that is helping to fill us up in some way, and it puts us into a desensitized state. And then we realize we need to press the reset button because that shame can be so overwhelming. We need to be able to start again, turn over a new page, clean the slate. And it becomes almost like this reinforcing pattern that we get stuck in, essentially. But the trouble with the pattern is that over time, it erodes our sense of self-trust. And we don't feel like we can be trusted. And so we need the control and we need the discipline because we can't trust ourselves. And when we can't trust ourselves, there's this sense that, I need to just be more disciplined. I need this is the all or nothing thinking comes in. So sometimes you can hold that resolve for a really long time, and it's like an active holding. But eventually something comes in, the protective pattern kicks in to bring some relief from the holding. And then there's the shame that comes with that. And then we have to press the reset button. That's when that purging comes, where we get to empty everything out and we get to start again. And it really reinforces itself because there's this fixation that we should have control, that we should be managing, it's that mind over matter idea. We should have, our brains are the ultimate controller, and we should be able to control everything that's happening in our bodies. And so when it comes to our bodies and our appetite, there's this reward if we have dominion over it. So I almost feel that we inherently feel what the word discipline was intended to mean, and at the kind of the etymology, the root of the word, it's quite punitive. It has a tone of punishment, and later down the track it was related to self-flagellation. So it's a way of keeping ourselves under control, ourselves chased. And the irony of that is that the more control that we try to have over ourselves, the more control we try to have over our appetite and our desire and our longings, the less we actually know ourselves, the less we trust the responses that arise or the desires that arise. And so the less we really know what we love and how we love it and what brings us to life and what animates us. And, you could say that control came in as a mechanism to make sure that we belonged in the group. But there was an expense, it was at the expense of ourselves. So we're less tolerant of those parts of ourselves that stop us from belonging, but it also makes us less tolerant of any kind of difference. So that could be our own difference or others' difference. And I wonder, who is it serving to be more disciplined? You know, we look at the natural world, and when we look at what is healthy, a healthy ecosystem, there is huge diversity. But in this need to belong, there is a sense of even phrases like my people, or the way you might see a group of 10-year-olds wearing the same clothes, you know, almost looking like clothes. Like, this need to belong becomes something that requires us to essentially abandon those things, that natural connection to appetite and desire and longing and what makes us different and what makes us unique, which also cuts us off in many ways from pleasure. And of course, if we're looking to grow, we do need some parameters. Like, we do need containment, because otherwise it can feel completely out of control. So I can understand that someone's watching this and thinking, oh, but Vive, we need discipline. I would say it's that we need a sturdy container. We need something to hold us that can be the vessel as we change, the alchemical vessel for the change. But that vessel isn't controlling what's happening. It's just containing it. We need containment, not control. And I think it's really important to just note that you can get yourself to do something through discipline. But when we use the mechanism of control, we get submission. You get the under threat response. You get fawning and freezing, and you get flight and dissociation and confusion. And that's been my experience with discipline, is that it does elicit a threat response. It does feel punitive. It does mean it triggers a protective pattern in some way. So I might have the control for a time, and then I need to bring something in, like I did with the food, with the disordered eating, to essentially comatose myself to feeling almost a sense of relaxing from the hypervigilance. I guess it's really important to make it clear that I don't think that this is not about we don't do hard things or we don't step into challenges so that we can stretch and grow. It's about what actually gives us genuine capacity for new things to emerge, be that in ourselves or our creative projects, or finding a new hobby or a career change, or moving into motherhood. Like, what actually gives us generative capacity that doesn't feel punitive and like punishment, that doesn't require that we're in control all the time, but we have a healthy container for that change to happen. Because the thing about capacity is that it gives us the ability to grow in a way that is emergent, in a way where it doesn't need to be specifically corralled, and we can be in a process of becoming. And that means that we can stay authentic to ourselves, that it can be something unique that's emerging, not some concept of what we need to be in order to belong. In my mind, discipline is like, you know, this mind over matter. It's like the all powerful Wizard of Oz. Whereas capacity is when we become best friends with our body. It doesn't need to be perfect. It can be inconvenient, but essentially we trust its responses. We're in it together. We're like collaborators. I think that if you are anything like me, or like I have been in the past, and you really believed that discipline was the only way to create change, that you would probably recognize these kinds of patterns, you know, the all or nothing mindset. Like, you know, I'm going to do scuba diving. So I go out and I buy the entire set of equipment. And then, you know, something happens that's really hard when I'm down there underwater, and then I never scuba dive again. Or you're perpetually getting on the wagon and falling off the wagon. maybe you'd feel like you don't trust yourself, or you find like your mind is setting some goals over here and then your body is doing the complete opposite over here, and you just feel like, you can't be consistent or you can't stick at anything. You're constantly berating yourself with that kind of thing. You might even like make a resolution to start writing again or having a creative practice. And even though you start out small, there's a sense of, well, that's not enough. So then you trying to write for 45 minutes a day instead of 5 minutes a day. And as soon as that ask becomes too big, too much, doesn't fit in with your life, you abandon it because it is genuinely too hard. There's too much need for it to be the perfect environment or the perfect mood that you're in or the perfect temperature in the room or the perfect, like, not being interrupted by your kids while you're trying to do the thing that you're doing. And so it's almost as if the all or nothing thinking that being disciplined brings in detracts from our capacity to start and become something new, for things to emerge. It becomes like a punitive and harsh way through which we judge ourselves when we're just at the very beginning of something. And when we're just at the beginning of something, God, do we need capacity to really suck at it? And that could be a parenting approach. That could be something creative that you're doing. There's a beautiful story that Syl Reed, who I consider to be a mentor of mine, who was also a student of Marion Woodman, she tells the story of Marion talking about this ability to fall in the gutter and then lift yourself out of the gutter again. And it takes capacity to keep falling in the gutter and getting yourself out again, to not just lie in the gutter and give up. But I feel what happens when we have the discipline mindset over the capacity mindset is that it becomes this self-fulfilling belief about ourselves. We're just always falling off the wagon, or we're not good at being consistent, or we just don't have any willpower or discipline. And that actually gives us less capacity to keep returning and learning and developing. So in terms of where this all begins, this capacity over discipline, this shift in how we approach a relationship with ourselves, essentially, it's certainly not by being more disciplined. In fact, it's about how we grow our capacity, how we resource ourselves. And I very much believe that is through the portal or the doorway that is pleasure. And I'm not talking just about erotic pleasure here, because pleasure is certainly evocative of that. But pleasure for me is this spectrum of emotions, and it is everything through from delight to joy to awe, even through to grounded sadness. It is that exquisite moment of experience where you are really feeling something fully in the body, and you're able to get the nourishment of that feeling. And, we can learn to recognize what is pleasure in ourselves, but then also through doing that, we learn to recognize when others are experiencing pleasure or delight. And then we can find what are those things that we mutually delight in. And that's been something particularly so helpful for me as a mother with my kids, was being able to be attuned enough to the kids to pick up those moments when my oldest daughter is delighting over the pancakes that she just made. And it's in those moments of mutual delight where we feel seen just for who we are, not for what we've achieved, not for what we've done wrong, but actually for who it is that we are, our essential nature. And that is a deep pleasure in itself, to be seen in that way. So this is how I see pleasure as a resource and as something that builds capacity and has a generative nature to it that is far more sustainable as a practice than being a disciplinarian, than having a punitive, almost tyrannical take when we're in relationship to ourselves. This is why I feel that pleasure is just so essential as a practice. And it might seem that is really simple, but actually having capacity for pleasure is, unfortunately, I think, a skill that many of us need to develop. Certainly something I found that I needed to develop, because pleasure has a charge through the system, just like pain. Anything that feels painful or tough or unfamiliar brings a charge through the nervous system. Pleasure does the same. And if our window of tolerance, if our capacity for that charge is limited, or the parameters are small, that is going to flood and overwhelm our system. We're going to have some kind of a response to it. So being able to build the capacity for the pleasure in these like little incremental ways is so essential for starting to understand and trust what it is we love and how we love and what animates us and what resources us. So when we start to consider this idea of kind of capacity building through pleasure versus control and dominance through discipline, we tend to bump up against some what I'm calling half truths. Because, of course, all knowledge is partial. There's always going to be perspectives that sit in opposition to what I'm going to share with you guys today. But here are the sort of three most common half truths that I think trip us up when we're coming into relationship with pleasure for ourselves as a resource. So the first half truth is that discipline is the only way we do hard things. And, without the stick, everything is going to get out of control. And essentially, there is a threat of chaos when it comes to pleasure. Like, pleasure is dangerous. You can't trust yourself with things that feel good. And maybe that's based on lived experience. There's probably a lot of evidence that supports that in some ways this dopamine driven addiction, this mechanism in us that is looking for the thing that brings us up or brings us down, that if we have too much of that thing, which someone might describe as pleasure, they weren't going to find ourselves in addiction. But I would say that the reframe here is that it comes back to self-trust. So if we don't have a sense of inner security, not insecurity, but inner security, like a sense of sturdiness in ourselves, where how we respond makes sense, where there's that coherence between kind of what's happening in the mind and the thoughts and the body, then it might be that we get really overwhelmed by pleasure, or we don't know what it is we really want, so we keep reaching for something that is like the scrolling, that is like the superficial dopamine hit. But if we can come into how do I trust myself again, and how do I see the patterns when I do try to experience pleasure as adaptive and protective, like how do I see what's happened is in the past as something that protects me, and hold that with some mindfulness, then perhaps we can start to reach through to actually meet the need that it is that we really have, that is going to satisfy us. So when I was reaching for that food as somebody with an eating disorder, I was needing to bring the system down. It was like there was so much hypervigilance and control for such a long time during the day that I would get home, and at night it would be like I just need to bring my system down and I need to feel relaxed, and the food brings you into this comatose state, essentially. You're reaching for that thing, or maybe you're reaching for the sweetness because all day you've been holding yourself together. It's a bit like you might think of it in terms of kids who neurodiverse kids at school who come home and they just let rip with all of their big feelings that they've been holding and containing all day. There's a need for the the air in the compressor to be released. So how do we be aware that that's what the actual need is and have that need met, or even just contained, for those feelings for the kids to be contained, rather than living out a pattern that we're bringing in unconsciously to bring in that felt sense of relaxation, like with the binging and the purging. And there's a great story actually in mythology about Pholus and Hercules, and Hercules is standing next to Pholus, and Pholus is a centaur, and Hercules is like, oh, he's got this big tub of Ambrosian wine, and Hercules is like, come on, take the lid off, take the lid off. It's 4 generations of this wine that's been brewing. And so Pholus starts to peel back the lid, and all of these wild centaurs come in, and it's complete chaos. And I think this is a really great metaphor for why we fear like pulling the lid off our own appetite when it comes to starting to get to know what it is that brings pleasure, because we are genuinely afraid of the chaos of the appetite being overwhelming. And so I say half truth because I think there is a truth to that. I think when we start to come into connection with our own desire and our own appetite, it is possible that chaos may reign. And so, how can we just peel that lid back just the tiniest amount, just in these incremental ways, so as not to flood and overwhelm the system? And when I first started to kind of work with my eating disorder, what I would do is when I had that binge purge moment, I would pause and I would try to bring something in, something that was gentling. Like I had a lot of baths. I went for a lot of like really little walks outside. Even just looking outside was really helpful. I went through a period where it was purely about gentling and softening to loosen the grip of that tyrant and of that discipline that was kind of holding me in this punitive way. And so there's this tempering that needed to happen over a period of time before I could really start to work with strengthening, with, running and powerful movement in a way that didn't bring back the disciplined mindset or the tyrannical mindset, in a way where the strengthening had a power and a generativity to it. And it was about trusting the urge of my body. Like, what did my body want to do? Could I trust it? How could I learn to trust it in the smallest ways? Like, what does it want to do? Did it want to bath? Did I want to just wash my face? Did I need a glass of water? It's amazing how over time we come to suppress like the most basic of urges. I remember listening to Kimberly Ann Johnson speak about this, and she was like, even when we need to go to the toilet in a meeting, how we suppress these natural urges and how that kind of extrapolates out into the rest of our life, relating to desire and to appetite and to what it is that we even need at the most basic level. So instead of wondering about whether it is that we need more discipline or whipping ourselves with that stick, that discipline stick, could we say, what capacity does my system need in order to hold the discomfort rather than control it? The second kind of half truth that I really find comes up a lot especially when working with mothers, especially for me as a mother, was that pleasure is self-centered and indulgent. And I think underlying that fear is actually that if I have needs, I'm going to be exiled or cast out. I think it's especially relevant if you are somebody who has a survival pattern that involves overgiving and being overly generous. And I think as a mother, I've just heard this so many times, and I remember thinking it myself, if I have needs, if I take care of my needs, someone else is going to suffer. Often it's the kids. Someone else is going to be inconvenienced. So we're needing to kind of almost wrestle with this, well, pleasure is just so self-indulgent. And, oh God, I might be perceived as selfish. God forbid, selfish. If I have needs, someone else is going to suffer, you know? And there's a truth to this, because if I go for my run, or if I go to a dance class, I have to ask my partner, hey, can you have the kids tonight? Or can you have the kids for a little while I go for a run? I just want to go by myself. And we do have to ask things of other people, and it may inconvenience them. And so how do we start to grow capacity for that inconvenience so that our needs can sit equally alongside the needs of others? Like, how does it feel when I say that? I even wonder. Like, do you squirm? I remember feeling super squirmy when I first started to consider this, when I first started to kind of challenge, oh yeah, well, pleasure's like, like self-care is almost, I would eye roll, because it's kind of like, yeah, well, it's sort of a bit self-indulgent, right? But here's kind of what I discovered, and this particularly was through starting a painting practice. Actually, it was drawing to begin with, starting to draw in my spare time. Was that when I would do things that animated me, when I would do things that delighted me, so much like kids, that brings in an energy, that brings in like a resourcing for me. And it means that when I come out of that place where I've been doing something that I love, I am coming from a place where I'm more whole, and I have a greater capacity to be with the kids' big feelings, or to notice their invitations for play, or to listen to something, to have my opinion challenged in some way. And I find I'm more resourced. And the effect, I guess that's highlighting that the effect of pleasure can actually be really surprising about how it shifts our state. That while we're saying, oh, this is, something that is going to inconvenience someone, or it's self-indulgent that I get to go take that time for myself, it's not considering the even greater benefit of what happens when we come into our wholeness, when we are more resourced, just to be with the challenges of the everyday life, of which there are many. There is a particular story that it brings to mind, actually, of working with a client, and I was teaching this in my class, this orienting to the room and finding something that you just notice that your eyes land on, and then just staying with that thing. And in this particular case, my client was in her office, and she was in a beige office, as she describes it. And she found a light in this beige office. And she was just, by orienting to this light and noticing the sensation that was kind of happening in her body as she oriented to the light, she couldn't believe how the state of her whole nervous system started to shift simply through being present with something in the room that spontaneously her eyes landed on. And it's something we forget. Like, we think pleasure needs to be going to a spa, or like a weekend away with the girls, or something big, something that's much bigger than just noticing something beautiful in your immediate surroundings, and really just paying attention to that. Shamali Gad from Awakening Women talks about pleasure being in the field. And this practice of orienting to the resource is really what taught me that really anywhere that you are, if we can trust the body to just let the gaze wander and the eyes land, and we can be with that and be attuned and present to that thing, whatever it is, whether it's the way the light comes through the window or it's the curve of an arm of a chair, that pleasure has this incredibly affecting influence And it's certainly not about being calm all the time, but pleasure has a way of bringing in something new to the system that can help to create capacity to be with something that feels more tricky. So, the question I often ask myself, or I did ask myself a lot, was what if pleasure isn't selfish, but what if it's something that supports me to be in my wholeness, to be more resourced? And if overgiving is something that you identify as having done a lot, it makes sense that starting to prioritize experiencing your own pleasure feels unsafe. And in fact, Uma Thurman, who is a sexologist, when I interviewed her, she shared a beautiful practice, and she was like, it can be as small as asking somebody to pass the salt. So it's starting this practice of just asking, even in the smallest ways, for what it is that you need, and then seeing if that will be met, if you can receive that. And the last kind of half truth that I think, and it even ties back into that first half truth that I was talking about, is that around kind of the danger of pleasure. And while that first point that I was talking to was about it bringing chaos, this one is about it potentially bringing inertia. Oh my God, if I sit down to rest, I'm never going to get up again. Or even if the kids are happy playing and they're in their own little world, it's like really hard for me just to pause and sit down and read a book. Or maybe it's it's really difficult to receive compliments, that I always deflect them. Oh, I find some other, oh yeah, this old thing, or whatever it is that someone has complimented you on. And it's that almost that pleasure will make us complacent. And perhaps we've had that messaging from somebody outside of ourselves around not feeling too much pride, don't get too big for your own boots. And this messaging has kind of come in lots of ways, like too much pleasure is dangerous. And if we understand, like I said before, pleasure as a charge, well, too much of a charge in the system is going to trigger a response. So often when we experience some kind of pleasure, and maybe it's we feel immense pride at something that we've just done, but then the next thing we know, we're worrying about the to-do list of all the things that we need to do next. Or, like I said, that we feel like really proud of something we've done, but then there's that voice of like, well, don't get too big for your boots. Like, don't self-inflate too much. And there's always this pendulating between the joy, and often it's really fast, this joy for a moment, and then back to the worry or the anxiety, something that starts to bring in some sense of control, some sense of like, well, be disciplined about this. There's a beautiful story from one of my students when I was running Tiny Rituals, which was previously called Gift Habits. And she had gone to school, she helped out at school with the breakfast club. And it was her birthday on this particular day. And I don't think she knew that anyone knew that it was her birthday. And so, anyway, right at the end of breakfast club, all the kids started to sing her happy birthday. And she said, oh my God, normally I would have just felt myself really retract and recoil from that attention. But on this particular occasion, she said, I noticed and I felt that retraction, but I was able to look at the joy and the delight on the faces of all these kids that were singing happy birthday. And I was able to receive this pleasure through orienting to their pleasure in singing me happy birthday. So the question here is, what if pleasure isn't something that I need to go and chase, but something that I can open to, that I can learn to receive? What if pleasure is about developing the capacity to receive, to open? Because here's the thing, if we don't know what it is that we love or how we love it, if we find it hard to ask or to receive, like even if we get lucky and we get to receive something, maybe we don't have the capacity to hold that pleasure. And so we pendulate back to something that feels like worry or stress or anxiety. We need to be sturdy enough to ask, but then also have capacity to receive the yes or the no. And I really do think that we grow that capacity through our ability to experience pleasure, to hold it, to recognize it in ourselves, which also helps us to recognize it in others. And then that final piece of the puzzle is that we can receive the nourishment of pleasure, that we can allow it to satiate us. So we have that sense of enoughness. So something I see again and again is that people think that the problem is discipline, where in actual fact, what they don't have is capacity. Capacity to get to know what it is they love, how they love, what brings them to life, what their appetite is, what they're desiring, and then the sturdiness to ask, the capacity to ask and to receive that, to be nourished by it. And this is why I created tiny rituals, because I knew there was this need for myself to be able to develop the capacity for pleasure, but in the tiniest ways, so I could build up that capacity, so that when I did receive the pleasure, it didn't overwhelm me, it didn't flood me. And tiny rituals are designed in such a way that this is working with the unique person. It's not some protocol that I'm pulling in from outside and pulling over and saying, this is the perfect morning routine. This is like, how do you get to know yourself? How do you have the capacity to get to know yourself without needing, and trust yourself without needing the stick, so that you can be in a place where what it is that you love and how you love it can emerge and then can be tended through these rituals. It's this getting to know oneself and trust oneself, to know the appetite, to trust the appetite and the desire, and then having capacity to be nourished and to feel that fullness, that enoughness through that experience of pleasure. So why does this matter now? And that's a question actually that comes up so much, is like, how can we be talking about pleasure when the world is in the state that it's in? And it's such a fair question, because we're flooded by news and information, and if we're in particular parts of world, we're actually dealing on the ground face to face with some of the most horrific things. We're in a state of flux and change and development technologically that we don't know what the outcome is going to be. We don't know what's going to happen next. And yet we've been raised on this skill of domination and control as a way to feel safe in our bodies, right? Our bodies, our relationships, our communities. But that sense of safety through control is a complete illusion. And if we don't trust our responses or our appetite, we're going to outsource that, or we're going to feel constantly hungry for more. We're sort of kept in this constant state of dissatisfaction, of not enoughness, which feeds our need to consume things, hoping that at some point we're going to feel okay. But until we come back to being in relationship with ourselves, with our bodies, in relationship in a way where there's a trustworthiness and there's a sturdiness, and it feels coherent what's happening in our responses, if it makes sense to us, where we're not reading from a script that we've gotten, or where we can really trust how we respond, and we don't then leave that situation and ruminate for hours and need to talk to 20 different people about what happened to try to make sense of the response. But when we know what resources us, what gives us capacity to be with what is unfamiliar and what is different, and also connects us into the things that we love, that bring us to life, that animate us, then we start to to build this sense of a secure base, of this sturdiness and this capacity to be with what is emerging, no matter what that is. So for me, pleasure is not something dangerous, but it is actually like our own inner water divining tool. And it's leading us towards what animates us and what resources us. And often it can be the counterbalance to something that feels really uncomfortable. You know, it could be a really disturbing dream. It could be a really confronting situation. And in this case, it's not that pleasure is a distraction, but pleasure can be the thing that resources us enough to be with what is activating or disturbing, so that this generative third way, a new way, can emerge. It helps us to be anchored in ourself and open to the world at the same time. So what if it isn't about more discipline and disciplining yourself, but actually how you learn to be in relationship with yourself? What if it's not about control, but it's about what supports you to thrive?